The Dutch-American ethnic group comprises Americans who have full or partial Dutch heritage. Dutch settlement in the Americas started in 1613 with New Amsterdam, which later was conquered by the British. After the Third Anglo-Dutch War, a treaty was made, and the Dutch rulers traded New Amsterdam and its entire New Netherlands colony for Suriname and what was known as the Netherlands Antilles to the British because of the trading capabilities of those islands. The British renamed it to New York. By the time the American Revolution, the Dutch were well established in New York City, and dominated many of the rural areas of upstate New York and nearby New Jersey. According to the 2013 American Community Survey, an estimated 4.5 million Americans claim total or partial Dutch heritage. Today the majority of the Dutch Americans live in Michigan, California, Montana, Minnesota, New York, Wisconsin, Idaho, Utah, Iowa, Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. Dutch presence in the present-day territory of the United States. Early exploration in 1602, the Dutch government chartered the Dutch East India Company. It sent explorers under the command of Henry Hudson, who arrived in 1609 and mapped what is now known as the Hudson River. Their initial goal was to find an alternative route to Asia, but they found good farmland and plenty of wildlife instead. Oldest Dutch settlement. The earliest Dutch settlement was built around 1613. It consisted of a number of small huts built by the crew of the Theodore, a Dutch ship under the command of Captain Adrian Block, which had caught fire while sailing on the Hudson in the winter of 1613. The ship was lost and Block and his crew established a camp ashore. In the spring, Block and his men did some explorations along the coast of Long Island. Block Island still bears his name. Finally, they were sighted and rescued by another Dutch ship and the settlement was abandoned. 17th century migration. In 1629, Dutch officials tried to expand the northern colony through a plan that promised liberties and exemptions to anyone who would ship 50 colonists to America at his own expense. Anyone who did this would be allowed to buy a stretch of land along the Hudson from the Dutch West India Company of about 12 miles, extending as far inland as the owner wanted. These landowners were called patroons and had complete jurisdiction over their domains as well as extensive trading privileges. They also received these rights in perpetuity. In this way, a form of feudalism, which had vanished in the Dutch Republic, was introduced in North America. The patroonships were not a success. By 1635, the Dutch West India Company had bought back 4 of the 5 patroonships originally registered in Amsterdam. The Indians were, at this time, no longer consulted or asked to sell their lands, and the Dutch were confronted with a new phenomenon: Indian raids. As the local tribes had now realized that the Dutch were not simply visitors but people set to take over their land, the Dutch realized that they had gone with the wrong approach, as they offered great privileges to wealthy citizens instead of the poor ones. It was not until 1656 that the Dutch state abandoned its passivity and decided to actively support New Netherland. The Dutch state issued a proclamation which stated that all mechanics and farmers who can prove their ability to earn a living here shall receive free passage for themselves, their wives and children. The result of all this was an increase in population from an estimated 2,000 in 1648 to 10,000 in 1660. Although the New Netherland were Dutch, only about half the settlers were ethnically Dutch, and Manhattan grew increasingly multicultural. The rural areas, however, remained overwhelmingly Dutch for over 2 centuries. In 1664, the English seized the colony and renamed it New York. The Dutch briefly recaptured the colony, but during peace talks decided to trade it for Suriname in South America, which was more profitable. 18th and 19th century migration. In the 100 years of British rule that followed the change of ownership of New Netherland, Dutch immigration to America came to an almost complete standstill. The only major group of organized settlers after the British takeover were a colony of 200 Dutchmen and women who founded what is now Germantown in 1683. Most of these settlers were Quakers who had come over in response to the appeal of William Penn. Penn, himself a Dutch Briton, had paid 3 visits to the Netherlands, where he published several pamphlets. Germantown is now generally thought to be of German origin, but it remained almost exclusively Dutch until the beginning of the 18th century. Only then did German immigration gain momentum, and soon dominated the area. During the early 19th century, large numbers of Dutch farmers, forced by high taxes and low wages, started immigrating to America. They mainly settled down in the Midwest, especially Michigan, Illinois and Iowa. In the 1840s, Calvinist immigrants desiring more religious freedom immigrated. West Michigan in particular has become associated with Dutch American culture, and the highly conservative influenced Dutch Reformed Church, centering on the cities of Holland and Grand Rapids. Waves of Catholic Dutch emigrants, initially encouraged in the 1840s by Father Theodore J. van den Broek, emigrated from southern Netherlands to form communities in Wisconsin, primarily to Little Chute, Hollandtown, and the outlying farming communities. Whole families and even neighborhoods left for America. Most of these early emigrants were from villages near Uden, including Zeeland, Berkel, Meel, Oplu and Gemert. By contrast, many Protestant agrarian emigrants to Michigan and Iowa were drawn from Groningen, Friesland, and Zeeland, areas known for their clay soils. The Dutch economy of the 1840s was stagnant, and much of the motivation to emigrate was economic rather than political or religious. The emigrants were not poor, as the cost of passage, expenses and land purchase in America would have been substantial. They were not, however, affluent, and many would have been risking most of their wealth on the chance of economic improvement. There were also political pressures at the time that favored mass emigrations of Catholics. Y.D.A. Schroeder, Dutch Catholic Immigrant Settlement in Wisconsin, 1850 to 1905, and H.A.V. M. van Stekelenburg, Landruising als Regent Ulver Schijnsel, van Noord-Brabant naar Noord-Amerika 1820 to 1880. 20th century migration. A significant number of Dutchmen emigrating to the United States after World War II arrived from Indonesia via the Netherlands. After Indonesia, formerly known as the Dutch East Indies, gained independence, its Indo-European population known as Indies Dutchmen repatriated to the Netherlands. Around 60,000 continued their diaspora to the United States. This particular group is also known as Dutch Indonesians, Indonesian Dutch, or Amerindos. 9/10 of the so-called Europeans are the offspring of whites married to native women. These mixed people are called Indo-Europeans. They have formed the backbone of officialdom. In general, they feel the same loyalty to Holland as do the white Netherlanders. They have full rights as Dutch citizens, and they are Christians and follow Dutch customs. This group has suffered more than any other during the Japanese occupation. Official U.S. Army publication for the benefit of GIs, 1944. These Dutch Indos mainly entered the United States under legislative refugee measures and were sponsored by Christian organizations such as the Church World Service and the Catholic Relief Services. An accurate count of Indo-immigrants is not available, as the U.S. Census classified people according to their self-determined ethnic affiliation. The Indos could have therefore been included in overlapping categories of country of origin, other Asians, total foreign, mixed parentage, total foreign-born, and foreign mother tongue. However, the Indos that settled in the United States via the legislative refugee measures number at least 25,000 people. The original post-war refugee legislation of 1948, already adhering to a strict affidavit of support policy, was still maintaining a color bar, making it difficult for Indos to emigrate to the USA. By 1951, American consulates in the Netherlands registered 33,500 requests and had waiting times of 3 to 5 years. Also, the Walter McCarran Act of 1953 adhered to the traditional American policy of minimizing immigrants from Asia. The yearly quota for Indonesia was limited to A100 visas. Even though Dutch Foreign Affairs attempted to profile Indos as refugees from the alleged pro-communist Sukarno administration, the 1953 flood disaster in the Netherlands resulted in the Refugee Relief Act including a slot for 15,000 ethnic Dutch that had at least 50% European blood and an immaculate legal and political track record. In 1954, only 187 visas were actually granted, partly influenced by the anti-Western rhetoric and policies of the Sukarno administration. The anti-communist Senator Francis E. Walter pleaded for a second term of the Refugee Relief Act in 1957 and an additional slot of 15,000 visas in 1958. In 1958, the Pastor-Walter Immigration Act was passed, allowing for a one-off acceptance of 10,000 Dutchmen from Indonesia. It was hoped, however, that only 10% of these Dutch refugees would in fact be racially mixed. Indos, and the American embassy in The Hague was frustrated with the fact that Canada, where ethnic profiling was even stricter, was getting the full-blooded Dutch and the United States was getting Dutch, all rather heavily dark. Still, in 1960, Senators Pastor and Walter managed to get a second two-year term for their act, which was used by a great number of Dutch and Dutch influence on the United States. During the American War of Independence, the Dutch were active allies of the American revolutionaries. From the island of St. Eustatius, they gave the 13 colonies one of the few opportunities to acquire arms. In 1778, British Lord Stormont claimed in Parliament that, if St. Eustatius had sunk into the sea 3 years before, the United Kingdom would already have dealt with George Washington. The Dutch were the first to salute the flag, and therefore the first to acknowledge the independence of the United States on November 16, 1776. The Louisiana Purchase, also known as the Great Land Acquisition, of 1803, is often seen as one of the most important events in American history after the Declaration of Independence. At the time it had a total cost of $15 million, and it was financed in 3 ways. First, by a down payment of $3 million in gold by the U.S. government, followed by 2 loans, one by the London-based Barings Bank, and one by the Amsterdam-based Hope Bank. The original receipt still exists and is currently property of the Dutch Inc. Group, which has its headquarters in Amsterdam. According to tradition, in 1626 Peter Minuit obtained the island of Manhattan from the Indians in exchange for goods with a total value of 60 guilders. Most aspects of the story have been called into question by experts. Minuit, a Walloon, was employed by the Dutch West India Company to manage its colony of New Amsterdam, the future New York. The names of some other settlements that were established still exist today as boroughs and neighborhoods of New York: Brooklyn, Wall Street, Stuyvesant, the Bronx, Staten Island, Harlem, Coney Island and Flushing. Many American presidents had Dutch ancestry. Martin Van Buren was the 8th President of the United States. He was a key organizer of the Democratic Party and the first president who was not of English, Irish, Scottish, or Welsh descent. He is also the only president not to have spoken English as his first language, but rather grew up speaking Dutch. Theodore Roosevelt was the 26th President of the United States. Roosevelt is most famous for his personality, his energy, his vast range of interests and achievements, his model of masculinity, and his cowboy persona. In 1901, he became president after the assassination of President William McKinley. Roosevelt was a progressive reformer who sought to move the Republican Party into the progressive camp. Warren G. Harding was the 29th President of the United States. His mother's ancestors were Dutch, including the well-known Van Kirk family. Franklin D. Roosevelt was the 32nd President of the United States. Elected to 4 terms in office, he served from 1933 to 1945, and is the only U.S. president to have served more than 2 terms. A central figure of the 20th century, he has consistently been ranked as one of the 3 greatest U.S. presidents in scholarly surveys. George H. W. Bush and George W. Bush were the 41st and 43rd presidents of the United States respectively. They count members of the Schuyler family and the related Beekman family among their ancestors. Dutch traditions. The Dutch introduced their own folklore, most famously Sinterklaas, and created their own, as in the legend of Sleepy Hollow. Wormuth 2001, Dutch language in Dutch names in North America. The first Dutch settlers lived in small isolated communities, and as a consequence were barely exposed to English. As the Dutch lost their own colonies in North America to the British, the Dutch settlers increasingly were exposed to other immigrants and their languages, and the Dutch language gradually started to disappear. In 1764, Archibald Laidlaw preached the first English sermon to the Dutch Reformed congregation in New York City. 10 years later, English was introduced in the schools. In Kingston, Dutch was used in church as late as 1808. A few years before, a traveler had reported that on Long Island and along the North River in Albany, Dutch was still the lingua franca of the elderly. Francis Adrian van der Kemp, who came to the United States as a refugee in 1788, wrote that his wife was able to converse in Dutch with the wives of Alexander Hamilton and General George Clinton. In 1847, immigrants from the Netherlands were welcomed in Dutch by the Reverend Isaac Wyckoff upon their arrival in New York. Wyckoff himself was a descendant of one of the first settlers in Rensselaerswyck, who had learned to speak English at school. Until recently, many communities in New Jersey adhered to the tradition of a monthly church service in Dutch. As late as 1905, Dutch was still heard among the old people in the Ramapo Valley of that state. Dutch is still spoken by the elderly and their children in western Michigan. It was not until 1910 that Roseland Christian School in Chicago switched to an English curriculum from Dutch. In the first half of the 20th century, the Dutch language was hardly spoken in North America, with the exception of first-generation Dutch immigrants. The marks of the Dutch heritage, in language, in reference to historical Dutch people, and in reference to Dutch places, can still be seen. There are about 35 Dutch restaurants and bakeries in the United States, most of them founded in the 20th century. New York City, for example, has many originally Dutch street and place names which range from Coney Island and Brooklyn to Wall Street and Broadway, and up the river in New York State, Piermont, Orangeburg, Blauvelt and Haverstraw, just to name a few places. In the Hudson Valley region there are many places and waterways whose names incorporate the word kill, Dutch for stream, or riverbed, including the Catskill Mountains, Peekskill, and the Kil van Kull. There are also some words in American English that are of Dutch origin, like cookie and boss. And in some family names a couple of Dutch characteristics still remain, like the prefix van, the prefix de, a combination of the two, van de, or te, which mean respectively, of the, if the, and at the. Similarities between Dutch and English are abundant. Examples include the article the words book, house, pen, and street, among others. Dutch and English are both part of the West Germanic language group and share several aspects. Adaptation of place names between the languages is common, as was the case of New York, where several landmarks like Coney Island became more suitable to Anglophones. Contact between other languages also created various creoles with Dutch as the base language. 2 examples, Jersey Dutch and Mohawk Dutch, are now extinct. This is possibly due to the ease of transition from Dutch to English, stemming from a shared linguistic genealogy. Little Chute, Wisconsin, remained a Dutch-speaking community, known locally as Speaking Hollander, into the 20th century. As late as 1898, church sermons and event announcements were in Dutch. Dutch newspapers continued in the area, mainly under pair by Catholic clergymen, were published up until World War I. The only remaining publication that is written exclusively in Dutch is Maandblad de Krant, which is published monthly in Penticton, British Columbia and mailed to subscribers throughout the United States from Oroville, Washington. The American state of Rhode Island is a surviving example of Dutch influence in colonial America. In 1614, it was christened as Rhode Eiland, meaning Red Island, referring to the red clay found on the island. Dutch American Heritage Day. As of 1990, November 16 is Dutch American Heritage Day. On November 16, 1776, a small American warship, the Andrew Doria, sailed into the harbor of the Dutch island of St. Eustatius in the West Indies. Only 4 months before, the United States had declared its independence from Great Britain. The American crew was delighted when the governor of the island ordered that his fort's cannons be fired in a friendly salute, the first ever given by a foreign power to the flag of the United States. It was a risky and courageous act. Indeed, angered by Dutch trading and contraband with the rebellious colonies, the British seized the island a few years later. The Dutch recaptured the island in 1784. Dutch-American Friendship Day. April 19 is Dutch-American Friendship Day, which remembers the day in 1782 when John Adams, later to become the second President of the United States, was received by the States General in The Hague and recognized as Minister Plenipotentiary of the United States of America. It was also the day that the house he had purchased at Vluwelenburgel 18 in The Hague was to become the first American embassy in the world.